Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Shaykh. Thank you for joining me in this final episode of discussing street epistemology in our Back to Basics podcast. Although time is not on our side, I wanted to conclude this approach of street epistemology and discuss the ethics behind their approach.
Yes.
Is there any ethical questions we can pose to them about their movement, and how do we challenge this movement?
I think I've always had ethical questions when it comes to street evangelist movements, be they religious or non-religious. In fact, dare I say, this is probably the first time I've seen a real non-religious street evangelism project. Never before have I seen atheists actually have a stand and try to convince people that God or religion isn't real. But one of the reasons I would say that there's a real ethical dilemma there is because you could very well be speaking to people who are a bit naive and people who haven't been very well educated in regards to their beliefs. And what it can do is have a tendency to just misportray the standard level of religious people's knowledge. Don't get me wrong, that's not to say I have much confidence in the average religious person's ability to justify their beliefs. I do think that we are all quite sheepish when it comes to what we believe. There's very few exceptions to the rule. But nonetheless, one reason I would say it's a bit questionable is they've seen religious people do it themselves, where you can be quite dogmatic and try to just pressure a person to change their beliefs in a particular way, following a particular structure. And what I would say about it is quite unorganic. And also I do believe that religion plays a very important role in people's lives. And so I know that this sounds very wish-washy, relative right now. And some people are thinking, well, it doesn't matter, truth is truth. Well, yes, truth is indeed truth. But there's a way you break truth to people, you know? There's a way that you try and awaken people from their slumber. And I do believe that you need to do so in a more organic way. Some of the videos I've seen where they literally pick on random believers in different faiths, normally Christianity, but they literally pick on random believers in such a way which is just patronizing and arrogant. And what they're not doing is giving the entire base of facts. So for example, that whole dilemma. Is faith justifiable? Can faith be an accurate way of ascertaining belief? Well, you're right, in most cases it couldn't. But there are indeed numerous exceptions to the rule where it could. So in order for us to even ascertain any belief, I need to be able to trust my mind. But as I've said, you're in a dilemma if you try to prove your mind's ability to reason and get things accurate, if you're trying to do so using an external justificationist model. You have to trust and have faith that your mind and what it processes are legitimately valid. And so in order to even have any accurate beliefs, you do need to take that first leap of faith. I do think what they're doing is extremely disingenuous by making out that faith is never valid as a means of ascertaining belief. Because we've ascertained that there's at least one place where you do need to have faith. And I think that's extremely disingenuous.
Yeah, what does seem quite worrying is the fact that this new age of atheists, they've made themselves appear as though they are agnostics in their nature, whereby they are close to believing in a God. They want to believe in something, but they just haven't seen the evidence for it yet, or they haven't been convinced of it yet. So when they're engaging in dialogue with a believer, that believer is almost deceived to the fact that maybe these guys are seeking the truth.
Yes.
However, they're the rational minds, and I have to convince them of that.
Well, I think that's definitely a major problem. And as I've said, in our paradigm shift of looking at Aqidah, one of the things we discussed is that when we say Aqidah, we don't mean a modern Muslim's aqidah, where he's actually a believer in liberalism and the ideas of a dominant worldview around him, but just happens to adopt an extra belief in a God called Allah, a prophet called Muhammad, and, well, the previous prophets of the Quran, in addition to 12 Imams, or if he's not a Shia, no Imams and the Khulafa. Instead, we mean a whole package of beliefs. So my definition of a worldview is an interconnected set of beliefs which explain away external reality in addition to internal experiences, and are the very lenses by which we understand those experiences and external reality. So if a worldview is that comprehensive, what we need to understand is to drop a belief in God, or to lose a belief in God, is not to only lose a belief that there's a creator, but also to embrace the full spectrum of consequences that come with that. One of my favorite books, written by someone who's far more sophisticated than the New Age or the New Atheist movement, is a man called Professor Alex Rosenberg. He writes a book called The Atheist Guide to Reality. Now, what I must highlight here is Alex Rosenberg wrote this book in order to convince people to embrace atheism in its fullest sense. He is an atheist himself, and he's not one of these unsophisticated atheists who doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a professor of philosophy at Yale University, not Yale University, Duke University in the United States, one of the Ivy League universities. He's the head of philosophy there. In this book, he argues that atheism is not merely the absence of belief in a God, but rather there's a whole worldview that comes with denying that God exists. Let's look at some of the things he states as a result of denial of God. I'm quoting from chapter 1, which is titled, Answering Life's Persistent Questions. Do you want stories or reality? He states, here is a list of some of the questions. I'll go back a bit so to give a context. This book aims to provide the correct answers to most of the persistent questions. I hope to explain enough about reality so that, as the old textbooks used to say, answers to any remaining questions can be left as an exercise to the reader. Here is a list of some of the questions and their short answers. The rest of this book explains the answers in more detail. Given what we know from the sciences, the answers are all pretty obvious. The interesting thing is to recognize how totally unavoidable they are, provided you place your confidence in science to provide the answers. Question 1. Is there a God? No. Standard, he's promoting atheism, so there would be no God. Question 2. What is the nature of reality? What? His answer? What physics says it is. Question 3. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. Question 4. What is the meaning of life? Ditto, namely there is none. Question 6. Why am I here? Just dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. Is there a soul? Is it immortal? Are you kidding? Is there free will? Not a chance. What happens when we die? Everything pretty much goes on as before except us. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. Should I be moral? Why should I be moral? Because it makes you feel better than being immoral. Is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, or anything else you don't like forbidden, permissible, or sometimes obligatory? Anything goes. What is love and how can I find it? Love is the solution to a strategic interaction problem. Don't look for it, it will find you when you need it. Does history have any meaning or purpose? It's full of sound and fury, but signifies nothing. Does the human past have any lessons for our future? His response, fewer and fewer, if it ever had any to begin with. So, just a few consequences of embracing this atheist worldview. Free will goes out the window. Morality goes out the window. Thought goes out the window. Now, I don't know if some people find the concept of us being robots attractive. Perhaps they want to argue it's a true concept. But I don't know about anyone else. But when you write a book like this, I kind of believe that the fact that you're engaging with me in a conversation process suggests that you believe I have free will. And yet the proponents of a modern day New Age atheist movement, people like Sam Harris, people like Professor Alex Rosenberg, are arguing that free will is just an illusion. When it comes to morality, there is a difference amongst the New Age atheist movement. Some of them claim that morality can be grounded in science, but the vast majority of them have acknowledged that there's no such thing as morality in the absence of God. As Nietzsche says, if we remove God, we have to remove the consequences of believing in a God too. So I do believe that when they call you away from religion and call you to not believing in God anymore, they do need to be quite clear about the consequences of that lack of belief in God.
Absolutely. But we see, in previous episodes, we've discussed religion as being the only rational explanation for us being on this planet
Yes.
and our purpose on this planet. Why do atheists struggle to see that rationality? They're the ones to claim to be the people of science, the people of objectivity. Why is it an ongoing struggle to make them aware of this rationality?
Some authors who write within the field of what we call intellectual history. Intellectual history is, I know it sounds very fancy, intellectual history. No, it's just literally looking at the development of human thought and what the intellectuals in each era have thought about certain things. They've argued that one of the consequences of a post-Enlightenment era is the development of the aqidah of liberalism, which makes us think that we have these freedoms of autonomy and that we have rights over everything and that we're so important because of that autonomy. Of course, this is an outgrowth of a Christian belief that we are created in the image of God and therefore we have these rights. In Islam, we ground these rights in different aspects and they have a different basis there too. But one of the consequences of that, according to these experts in intellectual history, or to be fair, some of these writers in intellectual history, is that people have begun to question the existence of God, particularly in light of one major problem. And it's that one major problem which I would argue is essentially atheism's trump card and dog in the fight against religion. That one problem is, of course, something that you and I are no strangers to. Every single viewer who's watching this podcast or will be listening to this podcast can affiliate with why this exists, namely the problem of evil and suffering. They ask, how is it possible that a deity who is all-powerful and loves us, and cares for us, and wishes for our sustainable future, and wishes good for us, could possibly allow the degree and monstrosity of some of the suffering that we see within the world today? And that, I would argue, is one of the main primary reasons that has motivated people to go down the route of atheism.
Absolutely. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel as though religious people, we're more apologetic than atheists in their approach. You probably see a lot of videos of Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, for example. Muslims or Christians, they're quick to criticize the actions of other Muslims or other Christians and say, oh, well, that's not us, that's them. whereas atheists have a more solid and unified approach with their arguments. They stand. It feels as though they stand together and criticize each other less. Is that an issue that we have within our own?
I think that, just as someone that has been familiar with some of the atheist movements, when you look at the American atheists, for example, you have these disputes between their major figureheads like P.Z. Myers and other people. And there is massive disputes and conflicts of charisma and personality within the New Age atheist movement. But yeah, definitely I would say that there's certainly a lot less takfir done amongst atheists against one another. And I don't think the average atheist has to worry that, like, if he doesn't believe that morality is objective or subjective, and his compatriot believes the opposite, that he's going to wake up the next day and get takfired or excommunicated from the atheist circle. But nonetheless, I think that's a reflection of how human beings are basically just horrible at times, and less a negative reflection of religion. We have to bear in mind that religion has existed in some of the darkest eras of human thought. And one of the narrations of the Holy Prophet ﷺ talks about, and also an ayah of the Quran actually, talks about a return to a jahiliyyah, a second jahiliyyah. We Muslims particularly in a very bad era of jahiliyyah. So I never judge anything based upon what Muslims do, because I know it sounds cheesy and generic, so like I'm not expecting to get a tap on the back and people to think I sound like a philosopher for dropping this line. No, it's a very cheesy and generic line, but I'm very glad that I read about Islam before I met Muslims in making a choice about the religion of Islam, because yeah, it's I mean, they're just as human as I am. And
But what kind of mindset did it require to? I'm sure these atheists have read about Islam, they've read about Christianity and Judaism.
Yes.
But what kind of mindset does it require, or intention does it require to read about these religions and open your heart up to them almost?
I do think that sometimes people's experiences will influence the way that they look at things. And unfortunately, there are some people that start off with certain misconceptions, certain biases. We've all got biases, and we all have a degree of bias. What I think prevents many of them from reading into things is just this daunting fact of there are so many religions. How do I look into every single one? And also, like, let's be quite honest. I do think that we as Muslims have failed to articulate the religion of Islam into the English language at the level required. So what do I mean by that? I mean, let's look at the average interfaith conference. You've got gentlemen as well educated and polished in the English language as the chief rabbi of, or the former chief rabbi of the UK, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. You've got theologians who are deeply entrenched within their tradition, such as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, their theology aside, let's talk about their theology to the side. I'm not interested in whether or not their theology is correct, but their ability to articulate their beliefs, the ability to engage with the history of this country and the thought of this country, means that they have an audience that Muslims could never have. And that's why many intellectuals in today's society are actually becoming Christians, because, let's face it, Muslims have failed to find speakers able to engage with society at that level. And I do say this goes back to what the Quran states, that we've never before sent a prophet except in the language of the people to whom he's being sent. Now do remember that when we say language, we don't merely mean the words coming out of his mouth. We mean a familiarity with their history, their culture, and what have you. So I do think that that's definitely a factor that's involved.
100%. If it was in my hands, we'd probably carry on this discussion for much longer, and it's a very deep discussion that requires a lot of thought and sincerity especially. However, that brings us to the end of this segment of Street Epistemology, and inshallah we'll carry on these discussions in the future. Thank you very much for your time, Sheikhna.
No problem. Assalamu alaikum.